What do you think? Can reckless endangerment be waived? Yeah, I know that sounds like a legal question, but today I want to ask it as a public safety question. Because somewhere, buried in a service agreement that almost nobody reads, there's language that says if your 911 location happens to be wrong, that's your responsibility. You were supposed to update it. You clicked agree. You accepted the terms. Congratulations, the checkbox absolved us. But did 911? That's the part we need to talk about, because when someone dials 911, they're not testing a contract. They're asking for help. And that's what's coming up next on TiPS, Today in Public Safety.
Welcome to TiPS, Today in Public Safety, your go-to podcast for today's breaking stories and public safety news. Here's your host, Fletch, with today's tips.
Welcome to TiPS, Today in Public Safety. This is Fletch. I'm a NENA-certified EMP, and every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I bring you the latest, most informative, and sometimes controversial takes on emergency communications. Today we're going to talk about a question that sits right in the uncomfortable space between technology, law, and common sense. Can reckless endangerment be waived? So first, let me get the standard disclaimer out of the way. I am not a lawyer, which is probably good because I'd be terrible at billing in 6-minute increments. That being said, I spend a lot of time around 911, enterprise communications, the very early years of VoIP, MLTS, service providers, and public safety networks, and have worked with all the creative ways that technology can make a simple emergency call very complicated. And what concerns me is this: some providers still rely on language that's buried deep in service agreement that shift emergency calling responsibility back to the customer or the caller. If the location is wrong, they should have updated it. If the device moved, they should have known. And if a user clicks agree, the providers are absolved because they disclose the risk. Okay, maybe that helps legally. Maybe it satisfies a regulatory requirement imposed by the FCC. But public safety is not just about whether the warning existed. It's about whether the system worked when someone needed help. A checkbox is not understanding. Look, we all know how the service agreement works. You install software, you activate a service, you log in to the platform, and immediately pops up the sacred checkbox. I have read and agreed to the terms and conditions. Yeah, sure you did. Right after you read that privacy policy, the cookie policy, and acceptable use policy, as well as the attribution clause and the paragraph written by someone who apparently gets paid by the syllable. I think it's safe to say nobody reads those agreements. They just scroll, they click, they move on. And when that agreement includes something about emergency calling limitations, we need to be honest about what just happened. The user did not understand the risk. They just clicked the button required to continue. That becomes a huge issue when it's a 911 location problem, because the user doesn't understand that moving a VoIP device can affect emergency routing. They don't understand that a softphone might carry an old registered location. They don't understand that a web collaboration tool with calling features may not behave like a traditional telephone. And they may not understand that responders could be sent to the wrong building, wrong floor, wrong town, or the wrong state. And if they don't understand the consequence, then we should be really careful about pretending that they meaningfully accepted the risk. Exposure isn't design. Now, disclosures matter. The FCC can require providers to tell customers when 911 services have limitations. That's appropriate. Customers should know when a service doesn't behave like traditional 911. But here's the catch. Disclosure isn't design. A warning isn't the same as a fix. Paragraphs in service agreements don't validate location. They don't update a database, and it doesn't test a call path. And most of all, it doesn't tell a dispatcher, be careful, this address looks a little hinky. So firefighters standing in front of a wrong building aren't helped. And it sure doesn't comfort the person who actually called 911 and is still waiting for help. So yeah, disclose the limitations, but don't confuse disclosure with protection. There's a big difference between saying this could fail and doing the work to make sure it probably does not. The worst location database is a human. Humans are terrible location databases, not because they're careless, not because of anything else, except they're human. They move, they forget, they work from home, they work from hotels, they log into soft phones, they move phones during office renovations, or grab Dave's phone because his is cooler and he's not here anymore. So they plug things into different ports. They click remind me later until later becomes never. And then one day, somebody calls 911. The system uses the registered location, but the registered location is wrong. And the call doesn't route just incorrectly, it routes correctly on incorrect information. So the wrong dispatcher sees a location that looks valid. Responders get sent. Now the emergency response is chasing paperwork instead of the patient. Technically, the system worked exactly as configured, but operationally, it failed. That distinction matters a lot because the system can be compliant and still be dangerous. That's why relying on the user as a final safety mechanism is a weak design. Hope isn't a location strategy, and they should have updated it is not much of a defense when everyone knew the consequences of not updating it could be life safety. The enterprise problem is even messier. Now this gets even more complicated in the enterprise. Today a 911 call may come from a desk phone, a soft phone, a collaboration platform, a contact center client, or some other application that looks like a phone but behaves very differently behind the curtain. And behind that curtain there may be a ton of players. The enterprise, the IT department, the installer, the UCaaS provider, the software vendor, the hardware vendor, the carrier, the 911 service provider, the location information server, the NG911 core services network. Yeah, everyone may own a piece, but the person dialing 911 expects one outcome. They want help coming to the right place. And that's why I recently wrote this in my recent blog, Understanding the NG911 Accountability Gap, because the modern emergency call path can be complicated. And when the call path gets complicated, responsibility gets really blurry. And blurry responsibility is extremely dangerous. The enterprise thinks the provider handles it. The provider thinks the customer handles location. The installer thinks they installed what was ordered, and the software vendor may think the disclosure covered it. And the PSAP or ECC gets a location that looks correct, even though that it's not. And that's not a good place for public safety to live. Somebody's got to own the outcome, not just the contract. Somebody has to not just check the box, they have to understand the outcome. The reality check. There's a legal version of this conversation and there's a public safety version. The legal version asks, was the disclosure provided? Did the customer agree? Was the limitation documented? And the public safety version is going to ask, did it get to the right ECC? Was the location correct? Did responders arrive where they were needed? Or did the system behave the way a reasonable person expected it to behave? And it's that last question that's important, because if a service looks like a phone, acts like a phone, and lets me dial 911, then most people reasonably expect it to work like a phone in an emergency. They're not thinking about SIP headers. They're not thinking about location databases. They're not thinking about registered addresses. And they're not thinking about the fine print. They're thinking, I need help and I need it now. And if that request for help goes to the wrong place, but they clicked agree, may not sound nearly as strong in front of a jury as it sounded in front of the conference room. That's not legal advice. That's common sense with a headset on it. The bottom line. So here's the bottom line on this. Can reckless endangerment be waived? Well, that's not for me. Legally, that's for attorneys, regulators, judges, and juries to decide. But operationally, I don't think so. Not in any meaningful public safety sense, at least. You can't checkbox your way around a bad 911 location. You can't bury life safety risk in a service agreement and call it solved. You can't shift the entire burden onto the user and then act surprised when the user behaves like a human being. Now, don't get me wrong, disclosures matter. Customer responsibilities, matter, and regulatory compliance matters, but none of those replace a good design, clear accountability, location validation, testing, and operational honesty. If you're providing a communications technology and it allows someone to dial 911, then 911 isn't an edge case. And that was the basic premise of when I wrote Carey's Law back in 2013, and I think that still applies today. It is not fine print. It's not a terms and conditions apply feature. In the end, it's life safety, and life safety deserves better than a checkbox. Because when that call fails, nobody is going to ask how nicely the disclosure was formatted. They're going to ask the tough questions like, why did help go to the wrong place? And if that answer is because the user agreed to it, then I think that we've got a much bigger problem than liability. We've got a responsibility problem. And in public safety, responsibility is not something we should ever try to waive. Hey, it's Fletch. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you learned something new. Remember to catch all of my previous episodes of TiPS, Today in Public Safety, published every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on most social media platforms and streaming 24/7 at 911tips.com. My blogs are located at fletch.tv and my personal website is at fletch911.com. Remember to like and subscribe. It really helps out the algorithms. And if you're in public safety, thanks for what you do every single day. We'll catch you next time. Take care.
You've been listening to TiPS, Today in Public Safety, your go-to podcast for today's breaking stories and public safety news. Hosted by Fletch and available every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Catch past episodes on 911tips.com. Be sure to like and subscribe, and remember to join us each week for the latest on NG 911. I am Spider Harrison, the official 911 voiceover dude. Catch me on Sirius XM on various channels, including 90s on 9, the 10 spot, and on the Weekend Countdown on Hits 1. Or don't regret it for the rest of your life. Either way, I'm good.